morning.
This is
Are we doing? I thought we were just using these mics.
you want to use this one? Okay.
Let me just ask. Is anyone offering to mic us up with the lapel mics?
If you want, do you prefer that to the handheld?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you prefer
okay.
the handheld or
Sure,
the?
I can do the lapel.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't have a very loud voice, so if it's too nobody's gonna.
I prefer the handheld since my cover if it's one for that, and then the other one is just like to control the volume. Because I think somebody would.
Mainly the reason as to why I speak with the volume. We had trouble with that yesterday. Some people can hear, some people couldn't.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm mic'd up now.
Sure, yeah, Brian's.
Are you okay for me to refer to you as Matthew? Or
Yes.
would you prefer to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Matthew's fine. So whatever's most comfortable for you.
Yeah, Matthew would be easier.
Perfect. Let's do that.
Hey, do you know where the switch is?
At the bottom. Yeah, that's the first thing I mentioned actually. I walked in. Me neither. I've actually sat on a chair before. This room specifically, it's better because
Is it a push?
Okay.
Oh, you mean it's on right now?
I might.
Switch there.
I'm asking.
Okay, you're gonna.
Yeah, I think-
Planner back.
Stay on
Okay.
track, but
All right, thank you. I have to see if I can sit on a bench like this for 45 minutes. I got kind of a junky back, so.
Excuse me.
Yes?
If you want to use handheld, this one is available. So
Okay. Well, I'm
it's
now.
better quality.
This is better quality, so I should use that instead.
It's more closer to the.
Okay. All
We
right.
will use this one.
Okay. So should I take this off?
Okay. We will
Yeah.
take this.
Take it off. Okay.
what's your name?
Oh, it was fine, uneventful. I went to bed like at 6:30.
Oh, that's
And then I
good.
got up at
Then you're up,
midnight
yeah.
and read this book, Wealth Supremacy.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, yeah, so, but I feel rest. Yeah. This thing.
Are you going to stay the rest of the day? What you going to do?
I'm not sure. I have some meetings with other colleagues in Dubai this afternoon. Some in UK this evening.
Okay.
But I will be around at least for a little while. I think I have to do some
Yeah, that's good.
Once it hits 11, you may start whenever you guys.
All right.
Just Fanette, you can just get their attention before we start.
Good morning, everybody. thank you so much for joining us today on this session. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Fanette Brandalac. I work at the WHO, the World Health Organization, on health futures. And I'll be the moderator of this session, which is going to look into the future of progress and how will nations define success in the future. I'm joined today by three amazing speakers, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves before we kick it off. So, Matthew, maybe we start with you.
Well, hello. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back here. This is my second time at the Dubai Future Forum. I was lucky to be here last year as well at the inaugural one. My name's Matthew Agarwala. I'm an economist at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and I'm a senior policy fellow at the Tobin Center for Economic Policy at Yale University.
Laurel?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. My name is Laurel Patterson. I work at the UN Development Program, and I'm the lead for our Sustainable Development Goals SDG portfolio. Great to be here with you.
Hi, I'm Brian Czech. I'm with the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, and we're based in Arlington, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And we have chapters around the world, and we hope to have a Dubai chapter soon.
Great, thank you so much. So, as you may have figured by now with the profiles of our speakers, we're going to be taking a bit of an exploration of, how we will define success in the future, moving beyond or thinking beyond economic growth and GDP as a measure of success. And historically, we've been, as nations, recognizing economic growth as a major driver of progress, and using GDP as a measurement to define how well we were doing as societies, where basically economic growth meant prosperity. Now, we've also been, while doing this and pursuing economic growth, we've been potentially breaching planetary boundaries. We've been also, as a humanity, overlooking some social concerns. And so there's a growing body of work and reflection around the fact that potentially economic growth and GDP are not exactly fit for purpose as we go forward. So in that respect, the whole reflection around the Sustainable Development Goals has been an important step in shifting from GDP as a main indicator to trying to value what counts for humans, and Laurel will elaborate on this later. But before I hand the floor over to her, Brian, would you be able to kick us off with telling us about your work around limits to growth and the steady state economy?
Sure. Thanks, Fanette. All right, so yes, I run the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, and if you're not too familiar with that term, probably the easiest way to look at it is if this is economic growth and this is degrowth, then the third alternative, the thing in between, that's the steady state economy. So at CASI, that's our acronym for the Center for the Advancement, we like to say that sustainability is a steady state economy. And when it comes to GDP, that is a great measure of the size of the economy. And in fact, I think we probably ought to back up already a bit and remind ourselves exactly what economic growth is. Because if we don't, then a lot of times there's kind of a fuzzy notion that it's some sort of magical elixir like manna from heaven or something. And in fact, economic growth is simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. So, you may have all kinds of sectoral readjustments happening. You might have more electronic cars here and less Hummers there. that may occur in a growing or in a degrowing or in a steady state economy. But growth is an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so that entails a growing population and or per capita consumption, per capita production and consumption of goods and services. And it's measured by GDP. So now at CASI, we are not one of the entities that says just get rid of GDP. We like to use a medical metaphor in thinking about GDP. If you were a doctor and you have an obese patient, poor thing, obese patient, the last thing you're going to tell your patient is to throw away the scale. The scale needs to be monitored more carefully than ever at that point. As it is with an economy, $100 trillion global GDP is alarming. And so that GDP needs to be monitored as carefully now as ever. But the wise doctor with that patient, the doctor's going to use a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope and other methods and metrics to get some sense holistically of the health of that patient. So I think that's largely a theme of the panel here, is what are some of those other instruments and metrics for a holistic sense of the health of the economy. And now I was asked to describe briefly the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. And in such a short time, the way I'll do that is hone in on biodiversity conservation. Because, biodiversity is like the canary in the coal mine of the environment. And if it's going down the tubes, that's very alarming for Homo sapiens as well. And so the way to describe that conflict represented with biodiversity is that the process of economic growth is a process of reallocating natural capital from the economy of nature on over to the human economy. And I'll elaborate just a little bit at each end of that process. So the economy of nature with its biodiversity, is like on a spectrum from nucleotides at the molecular level all the way to biomes at a really crude ecosystem level. But somewhere toward the middle of that spectrum is the species. Yeah, these other creatures on Earth that we love and that we have an emotional, practically, connection with. And in nature, in a state of ecological integrity, they're in that economy of nature in very complex, intricate, connected, functioning ecosystems. Now, as the capitalist or the socialist economic growth planner, we're looking at that economy of nature and we're saying there's a bunch of natural capital there. There's woods, waters, soils, minerals, fisheries, and so on. And we're going to have to take that and bring that over here, and then with labor and manufactured capital and financial capital, we convert that natural capital into goods and services, producer and consumer goods and services. In other words, intermediate and final goods and services. And it's those final goods and services that are measured in the measurement of GDP. So I think that helps describe the theoretical conflict between growth and biodiversity conservation. And then thinking about it empirically, if you look at why there are so many more species added to the list every year of imperiled species, endangered species, the causes of that, the causes of species endangerment are like a who's who of the global economy. Because once again, you had to reallocate all that natural capital, and different sectors of the economy are focused on different elements of natural capital than other sectors. So, and that's from the production side, but you also have the throughput, the pipe of throughput, if you will, at the end of which is pollution. including the greenhouse gases, of course, that cause that other little environmental problem that'll be focused on here in a couple weeks. There's just a couple more things I want to say about that conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, and then I'll be done. It's not like a tree hugger thing, because the environment, of course, is the foundation for tomorrow's economy, future economy. 7 generations, as Native Americans in North America would say. So it's really a conflict between economic growth and economic sustainability, kind of ironically. And economic sustainability is required for national security, security of nations, and international stability. So really, it's a conflict between economic growth and 4 really important things: environmental protection, economic sustainability, national security, and international stability. And then secondly, about that conflict, it's not something to be reconciled via technological progress. It's a fundamental conflict because it redounds to the first 2 laws of thermodynamics and basic principles of ecology. And we could probably summarize it with 1 sentence, and then I'll be done. You could say, with just a little bit of ecological jargon, you could say, due to the tremendous breadth of the human niche, which expands via technological progress, the human economy grows at the competitive exclusion of non-human species in the aggregate.
Thank you. Thank you for kicking us off and pushing the boundaries of what we might be thinking around growth and sustainability. And talking about sustainability, Laurel, if we don't entirely throw away the scale of GDP, can you tell us a bit more about the work around the Sustainable Development Goals and why it's very important now in this period of time that we consider other indicators beyond the GDP?
Thanks, Fanette. And let me go back to the analogy of the patient and play around with it for a minute. So if you're that patient and you find yourself in a doctor's office with a set of statistics which indicate certain things probably extremely troubling for you, now let's open up that discussion space about what's most important to you. You didn't walk into that doctor's office out of the blue. So there's a history, right, that has different drivers that are environmental, they're social, they're cultural, they're economic, that brought you to that state, which has put you out of sync, probably, right, with your own body in different ways, and it's now showing up in these different metrics. You have a series of solutions, of potential pathways and opportunities ahead of you, and you can't do everything at once. You probably got a solid dozen indicators that all need work. You can't address them all at once. What are the most important things to address first? And I'll say it a different way. What are the most important things for you to address first? Because the pathway for me to tackle that challenge versus you will be different for many, many different reasons. But what's critical is that we identify the pathways that we can action based on our experiences as well as based on our future ambition for ourselves. Where do I want to be? What do I aspire? Because those are the kinds of questions that energize our action. And what I think is really important for us, this is our second day, this is our final day, is we have to focus on this gap between what we know, what we feel, what we believe, and what we do. Because collectively, we're producing results that none of us want, and yet we are. So how do we bridge that? And for me, what's really important, thinking about the economy, thinking about how success of nations in the future, is making that really contextualized. And starting with, we don't start from outer space, and we don't start as if we just arrived here one day, starting by understanding what brought us here, and where are our centers of energy? What are those acupuncture points that can start to create a flex in the system for more positive gains? Because we can't do everything all at once. And fundamentally, what we see in holistic health, just to go back to that example one more time, is that there's a lot you can do yourself without an intervention from somebody else or the medical profession. Change the way you eat, understand food as medicine, et cetera, et cetera. Those are within your control. It builds your agency, right? And those are the things that likely have the most sustainability in a medium to longer term. So when we think about GDP, I'll roll back to GDP, there's clear limitations to what it can offer. So it doesn't really provide any kind of proxy for development for all of the reasons I just mentioned, because development is multidimensional. It changes, it's dynamic. It doesn't sit in sectors, it sits at intersections, and it changes for us over time. So we need measurements and ways of thinking about success that allow us to capture that. The second thing, in relating to what Brian had said that GDP doesn't allow us to do, is really understand how we created that wealth and what we're going to do with it next. Neither. We can't see either. So therefore, the quality of growth becomes a very important question for a room like this. It's not only for economists to answer that question. The third thing that's missing and important for us to consider when we're thinking about the future of progress is directionality. Are we seeing changes in the way we're growing that are smarter, that are greener, that are more inclusive? Can we measure that? And where I agree with Brian is that if you can't measure it, it's very difficult to set milestones and know where you're headed. So some of the things that make GDP effective is that it's quite concise. It's comparable across countries, right? So when we think about the metrics for the future of economy, for future of access, similarly, we need to ensure that those are metrics that we can compare, right? So one of our propositions, and there's a lot of work that has happened over decades in trying to imagine beyond GDP, the question I think for you and for us is why has that not moved forward into a different model? It's not a new question. It's actually quite an old question. So this, again, I think is a really powerful space for futurists and foresight to say, why didn't? What are we missing? How might we? And part of that will be imagining the future as we want to actualize it. And without being able to do that, it's very difficult to move the action that we need, particularly when we operate in entrenched power systems, right? That don't really have a lot of incentive to do anything different. So for us, and coming back to the SDGs, there's an opportunity space in the SDGs to start to think about the different dimensions of development, sustainable, economic, social aspects. And there's a whole measurement metrics that goes along with that. One of the things for the people that were involved from the SDGs from the beginning of 2015, there was a huge process in setting the ambition, transforming our world. That's the tagline of the 2030 agenda. And an agenda not only for today, but for future generations. It's a systems agenda and it's a futurist agenda. And then set that aside. The implementation of it was not as clearly thought through as that vision. So what we found when the goals were agreed in 2015 is that the measurement of them lacked. And even today, we're only able to measure with internationally comparable metrics for 140 of the 169 targets. So there's a lot that we know more of than we did before, but there's a long distance to go. My perspective would be, looking at the challenges that we see today, we need to take that vast landscape. I like to think of the SDGs, when you think about the targets, not the goals, as an opportunity landscape. It's integrated, and it interacts. They're interdependent, those goals. Is start to think about that in terms of well-being, right? What does well-being mean for us? It means our safety, our personal as well as our collective safety in communities. It means health. It means our ability for self-actualization as much as for social relationships and so on. The second around sustainability, clearly. How do we live within planetary boundaries and act as stewards for the planet? And the third would be resilience. How do we move from a vulnerability framing to one of resilience? How would we measure that? What would it look like? And how could we then start to direct our attention, our financing flows to those areas against those metrics? That's a huge opportunity space for us. What it would require, this may be slightly controversial, is not 231 indicators. It truly wouldn't. You'd need maybe 10 core metrics, core indicators, and you have to absolutely fundamentally contextualize those. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all. It will fail. And we'll find ourselves coming back 10 years from now talking about the future of GDP. We don't want to do that, and there's no time to do that. So some of our work at UNDP has focused on working very closely with countries to start to move the needle on some of these issues. We looked ahead of the SDG Summit with 95 countries at the way that they're growing. And then we asked 2 questions. Is that growth sustainable, by looking at their carbon footprint? And is it inclusive, looking at short-run poverty simulations? And what we found is that 72 out of 95 countries have increased their emissions since 2019. And we used 2019 so that we could understand COVID impact. 80% of those countries are either stagnant in terms of their poverty levels or they're moving backwards. So this tells us that something is fundamentally broken in our system, and our metrics, as they stand right now, aren't able to capture that sufficiently. We ask countries further, what are an opportunity space that starts to activate those acupuncture points? And some of the things that come up, and I know Matthew will talk about this as well, was around jobs and growth, quality growth, and not jobs for the sake of jobs, but jobs that empower women. Okay, that's target 5.5. I'll play a little target game with you here. That empower young people, 4.4, and that build social inclusive for all people in society, 10.2. And we've got metrics for that. So I think the key is to be able to build from some of what we have and certainly what we've learned. But with a group like this, the question becomes, how do we imagine that future? And once we imagine that future, then we're in a much better position to identify the metrics that matter. And as I sit in the middle of 2 economists and confess to you that I'm not one, it's really fundamental for you and us as futurists that we work collectively in identifying what those metrics are. It cannot be the sole purview of one discipline or another to determine these. But what it means is for all of us, and I believe this is a really exciting opportunity space in terms of measurement, future of progress, future of economy, is really truly to think about how you could learn more about other disciplines, which may not be your area of specialization. How could you act as your own investigative journalist? Find out more. Ask the questions that are uncomfortable because you literally have no idea. Good. You know, and I think so long as we stay really firmly at the bottom of a learning curve, where we have the most humility, this is really the way that we can start to build collaboration so that next time we come together, we'll be talking about progress on that different set of metrics and a different way of thinking about growth of economies and success of nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel. Lots of very interesting points. Contextualization, multidimensional development, quality of growth, and directionality. So, Matthew, if the SDGs are kind of the direction of travel, could you tell us a bit more about your research and your area of work around inclusive wealth and how that might help realize some of these ambitions?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. I feel a bit unlucky that I have to speak after these brilliant speakers because by comparison I may pale. But I'm going to promise you something, an economic measure that is inherently futurist. It's inherently forward-looking. But before we get to that, I want to take a look back at where we've come from. GDP, the precursor to GDP, gross domestic product, was first developed in about the 1930s by an economist named Simon Kuznets, who was working for President Roosevelt. His question, the president's question, was, can the US afford to enter the war? This is the Second World War. And he had to come up with an answer. Do we have an economy sufficient to be able to enter that war? And that was the first starting point for GDP. In the nearly century since then, economies all around the world have targeted GDP growth as the objective, as the definition of progress. But Simon Kuznets warned on day one that his version of GDP was not a measure of welfare, should not be used as a measure of welfare, and could not be understood as such. It was merely a measure of the size of the economy. I think over the past century, GDP growth has actually brought about a wonderful transformation in the human condition. We have seen life expectancy extended. literacy rates and access to education improved. The proportion of the global population suffering in abject poverty has collapsed. Access to nutrition and food and health care has been improved in all corners of the world, and we have seen the empowerment and enfranchisement of women and minorities into political systems all around the world as well. Now, these gains are unequal across countries, certainly, but there are gains in every part of the world unambiguously. That's an amazing transformation in the human condition in just 100 years. So GDP growth has done many wonderful things for us. The problem is that it has also released 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. It has pushed 1 million species to the brink of extinction. And in just the past 50 years, we have seen a 70% decline, that's the global average, in wildlife populations. And as yet, GDP growth has failed to address a series of crises of inequality around gender, race, income, within countries and between them. And for this reason, I think GDP growth is no longer a measure fit for purpose for the future of progress for our species. GDP growth was of and for the 20th century, where the rate-limiting factor was that most people didn't have enough stuff, enough food, clothing, shelter, health care. And it's a great measure of how well we are addressing those constraints. But the mounting climate, biodiversity, and inequality crises that we face cannot be solved by GDP growth alone. We need a new economic model. And the way that I like to describe that model, if you'll permit me to leave the patient analogy and introduce one of my own, is that we should imagine that we are running a bakery. The size of the pie that we can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in our pantry. If we run out of ingredients, then tomorrow's pie is unambiguously smaller. Well, it turns out that after half a century of research and half a dozen Nobel laureates and some of my brilliant Cambridge colleagues, Professor Siddhartha Dasgupta, Professor Dame Diane Coyle, and others, we have discovered that the economy operates just like that bakery, except that the size of the pie in the future isn't going to be measured in dollars of the pie. It's going to be measured in quality of life, and that the core ingredients in our economic pantry are not flour and sugar and milk. They are capital assets, broadly defined to include natural capital, those elements of nature like a stable climate system, healthy ecosystems, fresh, clean water, safe air that doesn't make us sick when we breathe it. These are capital assets that underpin economic productivity and output. So too is our human capital, the health and skills of the population. Our social capital, the degree to which we trust each other, we trust in business, we trust in governments, the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems. That's a capital asset in the economy. Physical capital, infrastructure, buildings, of course, hugely important. Combined, it is these capitals, our natural, human, social, and physical capital, that determines our economic pantry. Those are the assets. They are the core ingredients of economic prosperity. And GDP growth measures only the size of the pie, but it ignores entirely what is happening in our economic pantry. And for too long, our economic statistics have encouraged us to grow the pie simply by raiding the pantry. And natural capital is the only asset that is in consistent worldwide decline. What we need is measures of inclusive wealth. We need to measure that economic pantry. And that's one of the things that we've been doing at the UN and at the World Bank and at countries all around the world. If the Sustainable Development Goals tell us the direction we want to travel, the world that we want, the outcome that we need, then it is our productive capacity, our inclusive wealth, our economic pantry that determines our ability to deliver that goal of achieving the 2030 agenda.
Thank you very much. Something really resonated with me right now that you just said around the need to measure things in terms also of quality, in terms of quality of life. And for us in the health sector, it's something that is really, really important. And there is a growing body of work around the fact that, you know, health and well-being have long been conceived as a means of attaining, of pursuing economic development rather than as an end of economic development or a goal that we should pursue. And because what we value determines what we do, if we switch the dial a little bit and place well-being and planetary health at the center as a goal of the economy, then that shifts also our economic systems and how we think about them. So it's really fascinating. Thank you so much. We're running a little bit late in the panel, so the next question that I wanted to pose to you, and I would ask you to maybe be really brief about it and give us maybe in a tweet format like someone said yesterday. In your view, what's the one thing that we can do to advance this area of work and to start moving beyond the GDP? Brian?
Well, if we have to limit it to one thing that each individual can do, sign the CASI position on economic growth, which is calling for the steady state economy and seriously what we might call steady statesmanship in international diplomacy. If we can't get to that transition of diplomacy that is centered upon limits to growth and the need for nation states to deal with that crisis on planet Earth, then futures are really bleak. And I'm just saying that, you know, a very small step in that direction is indeed to sign that. So that's at steadystate.org.
Thank you, Brian. Laurel?
So for me, I think for what we can do, literally us in this room, think across disciplines where you can start to build bridges. What are the questions that you would want to ask? And challenge yourself. If you're a health expert, if you're a governance expert, challenge yourself not to put your issue in the center of the network. It's so hard not to do that, right? But we'll say health is a driver, which it is. Effective institutions is a driver, which it is. It is. But as soon as we put ourselves in the middle, we create a gap rather than a bridge to what we need to understand, which is that collective action, to the point that Matthew made. To me, why is that so important for us? Because we need to act collectively to influence at the level that we would be required to see this future change. It's not a given. There's far more vested interest in keeping things exactly the way that they are. We understand that. Than it is to change. Change often happens from the periphery, with people like you, asking tough questions, not giving up, your perseverance. So I really think these are some of the most important things. Put yourself in a position of some discomfort. Ask questions you don't know the answers to. Use the opportunity of today before everybody goes back to start to build those alliances. We have to think politically and tactically about these things as much as we need to think sort of conceptually and substantively about its drivers and elements. That wasn't a tweet, but that's it.
It's great, thank you. Matthew?
So I think the most important thing that we need to do is shift our focus from short-term income to thinking about long-term wealth. I promised you a measure of the economy that is future-proofed. All capital, by definition, is based on the future. It is forward-looking. The value of any capital asset today is by definition the net present value of the future flow of returns that we get from it. The value of a share in Apple is the net present value of the future dividends. That's an economic fact. We need to shift our focus from just thinking about the short-term income to start thinking about how we are building wealth, natural, human, social, and physical capital. If we do this, I think we don't have to accept the steady state economy. Whether you're pro-growth, degrowth, post-growth, If you're defining your measures in terms of GDP, you've already missed the boat. If we're thinking about growing the pantry, we can grow that continuously by investing more in human and social and natural capital.
Thank you. That concludes the formal part of the panel, but we wanted to open the floor to questions from the room, if you have any, and just wanted to leave you with maybe just a reflection that, as you may have heard, this is a topic where there are different views, and we also wanted to open that space up for conversation and to bring that to the table. So if anyone has any questions, do raise your hands. We have time for about three or four. Yes, a gentleman on the left.
Thank you for your kind information. My question for Mr. Matthew. To do this kind of change for the individual level, do you think we need to do many change on our lifestyle, and how we can do that from the individual level?
Answering now, or are we taking group? I think you're absolutely right. Lifestyle change is going to be a part of this solution, no matter what. But there are things that we can do to minimize the impacts on our current ways of life, right? We like to drive places. Fine. Do we have to drive places in an internal combustion engine vehicle, or can we drive places in an electric vehicle? You can still drive, but you can radically reduce the impacts on nature, on natural capital by doing so. Yes, we like to eat probably too much food, but do we have to produce that food in the most environmentally destructive manner possible? Or can we innovate, improve ecological productivity from the farming sector, and use that to feed the world in a net zero, carbon compliant, biodiversity rich capacity? I think there's opportunities to do so, but we need the leadership to make it happen.
Thank you.
There was another hand in this. Yes?
Hi. My question is, as most of the economists today say that the age of the low interest rates or zero interest rates are over, so we might be going for a long period of high interest rates. How would that impact sustainability and also the non-reliance on metrics like GDP and all, the new era of high interest rates?
Does anybody want to take that, or shall?
Yeah, I'll give it a crack. It seems to me that the monetary sector has to reflect the real sector, or you either have inflation or deflation. So if the fact is that the monetary policy has been too expansionary, as it clearly has in many nations and worldwide overall, you're going to have inflation like we have. It's too much money chasing too few goods. And due to the limits of the pantry, starting and centered around the economy of nature, there's certainly, which we are broaching as we speak. We're at the limits to growth. You look at the research of the Global Footprint Network, which calculates the ecological footprint of anything from the individual to the planetary economy. And we're using way too much natural capital than can be sustained. The only way that this is able to happen is we're liquidating the stocks of natural capital. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have to get serious about a steady state economy, because when you run out of the natural capital, you can't make something from nothing. You can have all the cooks in the kitchen that you can pack in there, and you can have all of the kitchen equipment, but if you've got no natural capital, there's nothing to cook with.
Matthew, did you want to also offer a perspective on this?
I'll be very brief. Higher interest rates make this much harder, but many economists have made fools of themselves by trying to predict what's going to happen with interest rates. I wish not to be one of them. The fact is the global economy has gone from squander and squeeze to squeeze and squander. This is not a good option. We had a decade of low interest rates and excess labor supply. Those are the perfect conditions for non-inflationary public investment in things like net zero transition, new infrastructure, supporting businesses on the innovation side to bring us in line with biodiversity constraints. We squandered that with a decade of austerity. Now we have to face these same investments with a decade less time because we haven't made that progress over the past 10 years. It's more expensive, it's more costly, it's harder to do. The simple fact remains, though, that the cost of inaction vastly outweighs the cost of acting on bringing us to net zero and on bringing us in line with planetary boundaries. And what I think this means is that in the discussions that are going to take place in this city over the next 2 weeks at COP, we must prioritize the access to finance at preferential rates for the developing world. As an example, the average cost of borrowing for a country in Africa is about 11 to 12%. The average cost of borrowing for the United States is about 3%. How can we expect these economies to be competitive in the race to net zero if they're facing a cost of borrowing that's 4 times higher than the wealthiest country?
Thank you. Laurel, did you want to also comment on this? I saw you nodding, so...
I'd share 2 thoughts related to that and the key of sustainable financing for the discussions this weekend and going ahead. Some of our research shows it's astronomical, the amount of government revenue that moves towards debt servicing in the poorest countries in the world. So some of our work earlier this year found that there's 50 odd countries, some of the poorest in the world, that spend 2.3 more times servicing their debt than they do on social assistance, 1.4 times more servicing their debt than they do on health investments. So again, without those foundations, it's incredibly difficult to conceive of making the most of thinking differently and moving into this space of possibility for the future of the economy. I did want to come back to the first question on lifestyle, and I wanted to push it a little bit further. So one of the things that I think as futurists and foresight practitioners we often grapple with is this sense of linear, incremental versus systemic or transformative change. And we say that, but then we have to check ourselves constantly. Are our actions moving towards an incremental shift? Do we have time for it? Or is it something different? And here I would put on the table one of the strongest indicators that could be supportive of the environment that we want in the future, which is a plant-based diet. It's the thing that most people don't want to hear. Okay, and I want us to hold that disappointment that you now feel that I mention it, because this is what we need to work through individually and collectively. We would have to change things that we like. It's part of our culture, it's part of our values, it's part of our behavior. It's part of the way that we've always acted. We would need to change that at scale. Governments would need to change it. And then what you would come up against, just to the point on politics, because I think we can't escape that, it's extremely important. You will come across a level of lobbying, of corporate interests, of government interests that you cannot imagine. Right? So I'm not suggesting that it's easy, it's probably one of the most difficult, but it remains one of the most powerful. And I really believe collectives like ours over these 2 days, these are the things we have to be putting on the table.
Thank you. There was a hand at the left. Yes.
Hello, my name is Annette Gardner, and I'm only saying that because I'm also the task force chair for the APF on foresight evaluation. And I just put that out there because we're doing our session this afternoon, but it's all about how we get to where Laurel is already at around talking about metrics, but do the work that comes before that, which is what are our questions? What are we trying to learn? And how do we tie that learning, which could be a number or it could be qualitative data. Just want to point out that we don't always need a metric per se, but as much as we need a good story that talks about change, and then tie that to action. So we're still building the base, or what I call the culture of evaluation in foresight. And then my other comment was on motivating us a little more around advocacy, because as a discipline and as a field, we really don't have that sense of identity or collaboration around advocacy, even though some of us are doing it. So again, I want to support you on keep reminding us that we need to put more thought to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
Can I
Brian.
answer?
Yes, of course.
I want to go back to the first question too. I think the shortest answer to what we need to do, what we can do for lifestyle change, is less. I mean, GDP is a measure of how much stuff is being produced, how much activity in the provision of services. It's too much. With 8 billion people on a planet and an economy of $100 trillion, it's too much stuff. And at the individual level, it just means the simplest way to put it at the individual level, or simplest way to translate less, is spend less. If you spend less, you're going to be doing less pumping of gas, less driving, less tourism, frankly. Less of everything, less buying of clothes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty simple, I think, just less.
I disagree.
Yes.
So emphatically.
What I'm
it's
thinking
not
is,
less, but different. Different. If we take the poorest person in the world and line them up to the richest person in the world and everybody else in the middle, the person in the middle, the median, what do you think is their annual income? $3,000 US, their annual income. The person in the middle, the 4 billionth person. So that means there are 4 billion people below that for whom the answer absolutely has to be increased consumption, increased income, absolutely unambiguously. Not less, but different.
I agree with him.
Okay, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond, and then what I think we can do is each of you can take a few seconds at the end to just give your final remarks on this subject, and then we close the panel. Mm-hmm. Does that work?
Yeah. So where there is widespread poverty, economic growth per se is really needed, yes, and individual consumption, more of it, is needed. I think we were talking about largely what people in this room can do today and tomorrow, literally, and I still think less is a good answer to that. We got to do less so that they can do more, because not everybody can do perpetually more on a finite planet.
Great. So different perspective, less so that others can do more. Laurel, do you want to say a few final words?
Maybe 2 final thoughts that we haven't covered yet, and Matthew, see if you want to come in on any of it. So I think what becomes really important in the metrics is spending the time on question intelligence, as was just raised. So what are the values that underpin that, and how would we qualitatively measure and quantitatively measure it? Because it's really important that these are metrics that can be understood across countries, they can be implemented. And so I think this investment in data, and I know we've heard it across a lot of other sessions today, is key. But an interesting statistic that I came across yesterday, 94% of funding for AI startups is focused either on those that are starting up those initiatives in the US or China. So the question for me isn't that data is expanding, it is there's opportunities, but who holds the power in that space? So I think this question of data is very important, and the ownership and leadership around it. We can't manage what we can't measure. The second thing that I think is really important is we have to continuously put people at the center of these metrics. Data needs to not only be for things that we can measure and look back on and talk about when there's a forum, but that people can use every day in their decision making. So that opens up incredibly interesting opportunity spaces for us to think about citizen data, about storytelling, and about being adaptive and dynamic and shifting those metrics as we're seeing different signals, patterns, and trends from the ground. That puts people at the center. That's resource intensive, and that's time intensive. And the last thing that I wanted to leave us with, so that's just what it is. Investments in data is expensive and time consuming. So if we're looking for a silver bullet, this isn't it. It's not it. And I really think we all have to be the honest communicators of the fact that this work is difficult, is complex, it moves in a couple of circles before it finds a landing place, and it requires resources, all different kinds of capital to make it possible. So for me, in a crisis, if we would say that globally we're finding ourselves in a crisis and we are nonetheless here trying to craft a way forward, not so much to do less, but collectively, I think we need to constantly remind ourselves to slow down. Take the time on the questions. Take the time to bring people into the room. Make it theirs. In a crisis, the key is to slow down so that we can really be effective. Then it can be an opportunity space. Otherwise, it's accelerating into a wall. That's not an optimistic ending point as a Canadian, but I'm going to leave it there for time.
Well, I think, Laurel, you made a really brilliant point that I should have also commented on, and so I'll do it now. It does cost money, it takes time and requires effort to develop the metrics to measure our economic pantry. And yes, there's a cost to that, but I would put it to you, and sure, I'm an academic, so of course I would say this, but the cost of information is always cheaper than the cost of ignorance. And we're going to face those high costs of ignorance if we don't decide to measure our economic pantry. I think I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining this panel today. We might be leaving you with more questions than answers, but this was kind of also one of the objectives of this discussion. And we hope that you continue thinking about how we might define progress in the future as you go into your next panels and discussions around the next few days. Thank you so much.
Let's see if I can get out of this chair now. Oh, man. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Eva. Appreciate that. Hi.
Thank you for actually also the comment on the website. I totally understood that. Thank you so much. Here you go, Laurel.